The orange extension cord, a lurid serpent in the pristine gloom of my assigned parking stall, was the first insult. It snaked from the shared power outlet mounted on the concrete pillar separating my space from hers. Its greedy little plug sunk deep into the socket, clearly marked with my unit number, Unit 3B, mine, not hers. Hers was Unit 3A, Karen Bartlett, a woman whose primary contribution to the condominium complex seemed to be the generation of passive-aggressive notices about recycling bin etiquette and the cultivation of an aura of perpetual simmering offense. This was the third time this week. The first time, I'd unplugged it, coiled it neatly, and left it on the hood of her gleaming, aggressively silent electric vehicle, a chariot of smug self-righteousness that apparently required a constant intravenous drip of my electricity. The second time, I'd added a note, polite but firm, printed in block capitals. "This is Unit 3's power outlet. Please use your own. Thank you." The note had vanished by morning, the orange serpent re-embedded. Now, witnessing its brazen return, something cold settled in my chest, a feeling I recognized from a past life I rarely revisited, a life where boundaries weren't suggestions, but stark lines drawn in unforgiving sand. My wife, Eleanor, relied on a CPAP machine. Our electricity bill, already a testament to modern anxieties, didn't need the added burden of Bartlett's eco-vanity. The subtle flicker in our apartment lights the previous evening, a momentary dimming as if the building itself sighed under an unseen load, now took on a sinister clarity. It wasn't just power, it was a leech on our stability, a parasitic drain. I photographed the cord, the license plate of her oversized electric SUV, the outlet, my unit number stenciled beside it. Documentation. Always documentation. The first step in any engagement is reconnaissance. I unplugged her cord again, this time with less care, letting it fall to the grimy concrete. I considered a more pointed note, something involving precise calculations of kilowatt hours and the petty larceny statutes of the state. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled the initial flush of anger, that it would be pointless. This wasn't about ignorance. This was about entitlement. This was a probe, a test of will. Bartlett, with her carefully curated victimhood and iron grip on the HOA bylaws when they served her whims, was accustomed to compliance. She mistook silence for weakness, politeness for capitulation. She didn't know that my politeness was a very thin veneer over a bedrock of something else entirely, something forged in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. The garage air, usually just stale with the scent of exhaust and old tires, now felt charged, like the moments before a storm. My jaw ached. I hadn't realized I was clenching it. This petty theft, this arrogant appropriation of what was mine, was a microcosm of a larger, more insidious encroachment I'd seen fester in places like this, where proximity bred contempt and rules became weapons in the hands of the bored and the bullying. The initial note was a courtesy. The second, a warning. This third transgression was a declaration. And declarations, in my experience, required a commensurate response. Not an escalation of notes, but a definitive statement. The kind that isn't misunderstood. The kind that echoes. I went back upstairs, the image of that orange cord burned into my retina, a fuse, slowly, inexorably, starting to burn in the recesses of my mind. Eleanor was asleep, the soft hiss of her CPAP a gentle counterpoint to the hard knot forming in my gut. This wasn't just about a few dollars of electricity. It was about the sanctity of our space, our resources, our peace. And that, I decided with cold finality, was non-negotiable. The game had changed. She just didn't know it yet. The next move would be mine, and it would be meticulously planned and flawlessly executed. This wasn't going to be a squabble. This was going to be a lesson. The following afternoon, a sharp, insistent rap on my apartment door shattered the fragile peace I'd been trying to cultivate. Not the polite knock of a delivery person, nor the hesitant tap of a neighbor. This was the percussive signature of unearned authority. I glanced through the peephole. Two figures, men I vaguely recognized from HOA meetings, one burly, with a security guard surplus windbreaker straining across his chest, the other reedy, clutching a clipboard like a shield. Bartlett's private militia. Her HOA cops, as some of the more cynical residents, myself included, referred to them in hushed tones. I opened the door a crack, leaving the security chain engaged. Yes? My voice was flat, devoid of inflection. The burly one, whose name I recalled was Dale, puffed himself up. Mr. Henderson, we've had a complaint. About you, from Ms. Bartlett. He said Ms. Bartlett with a reverence usually reserved for minor deities or major donors. The reedy one, thin-lipped and bespectacled, peered past me into the apartment, his gaze lingering on Eleanor's framed photograph on the console table. A petty man, cataloging perceived weaknesses. A complaint regarding interference with her vehicle charging? Reedy elaborated, his voice a high-pitched whine. And aggressive behavior. Aggressive behavior? For unplugging a cord from my own socket? The sheer audacity of it was almost breathtaking. Interference? I repeated, my tone still level, though a glacial anger was beginning to creep up my spine. She was, and I suspect still is, stealing electricity from my designated outlet. I left a polite note. She ignored it. I unplugged her vehicle. That's not interference. That's rectifying theft. Dale's face reddened. Now see here, Mr. Henderson, Ms. Bartlett is a long-standing resident, and the HOA takes accusations against other residents very seriously. She says you're creating a hostile environment. A hostile environment? I allowed a sliver of ice to enter my voice. She's the one creating a hostile environment by trespassing on my resources and then sending you to intimidate me when I object to her petty larceny. Is this an official HOA action? Are you serving me with a formal violation notice based on this hearsay? I looked pointedly at the clipboard. Reedy fumbled with it. Well, not a formal notice yet. This is more of a strong recommendation to desist from unplugging Ms. Bartlett's car. Desist from preventing theft from my own property? I raised an eyebrow. Are you, on behalf of the HOA, officially sanctioning Ms. Bartlett's unauthorized use of my electricity? This was a critical juncture. Their response would be logged, mentally and, if necessary, otherwise. Dale stepped forward, his bulk filling the doorway. We're just trying to keep the peace, Henderson. She needs to charge her car. There aren't enough public chargers yet. Just let her use it. What's the big deal? What's the big deal? The casual dismissal, the inherent expectation that I should subsidize her convenience, her lifestyle. It was the classic bully's gambit. Frame their aggression as your inflexibility. The big deal, I said, my voice dropping, each word precise, is that it's mine. The electricity, the outlet, the parking stall. And your presence here, attempting to coerce me into accepting theft, is a gross overreach of HOA authority. If Miss Bartlett has an issue, she can take it up with me directly or through legitimate legal channels, not by dispatching enforcers. I let my gaze sweep over them, a cold assessment. They were amateurs, playing at power, drunk on the thimbleful of authority Bartlett had poured for them. But even amateurs could be dangerous if they pushed the wrong person too far. They had crossed a line, moving from enabling a petty thief to actively participating in harassment. Unless you have a warrant or a legitimate, documented HOA violation notice to serve me, I continued, this conversation is over. Please remove yourselves from my doorway. Reedy looked to Dale, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Dale, however, was made of sterner, if duller stuff. You're making this difficult, Henderson. No, I corrected him, my gaze unwavering. I'm making it clear. This is my property, my rights, and I will defend them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I began to close the door. Dale put a hand out, not touching the door, but a clear gesture of resistance. Miss Bartlett won't be happy. Miss Bartlett's happiness, I said, my voice now carrying the full weight of my resolve, is not, nor has it ever been, my concern. Her adherence to basic property rights and common decency, however, is, and she has failed spectacularly on both counts. Good day. I closed the door firmly, the click of the deadbolt loud in the sudden silence. The chain remained. They lingered for a moment, a muffled exchange of words, then their footsteps receded down the hallway. They had delivered their message. And in doing so, They had delivered Karen Bartlett's true message. She would not stop. She felt entitled. She felt empowered by her HOA cronies. And she believed there would be no consequences. That was her critical miscalculation. They didn't know who I was. They didn't understand the depths of my patience, nor the precision of my response when that patience was exhausted. This wasn't just about an extension cord anymore. This was about principle. About the quiet enjoyment of one's home being methodically eroded by a narcissistic parasite and her witless enablers. The coldness in my chest had solidified, no longer a feeling but a state of being. The decision was made. Retaliation was no longer a consideration. It was an operational imperative. The transition from civilized resident to a reluctant warrior is not a sudden metamorphosis. It's a slow, corrosive process, an erosion of restraint under the relentless drip of provocation. Karen Bartlett, with her entitled assumptions and her blustering HOA foot soldiers, had become that corrosive agent. They thought they were dealing with another mild-mannered suburbanite, easily cowed by manufactured authority and veiled threats. They had no concept of my previous life, a life spent in environments where the rules were stark and survival often depended on understanding the intricate dance of power, leverage, and meticulously planned deterrence. I had been an electrical systems engineer, specializing in high-voltage arrays and failure analysis for critical infrastructure, sometimes in places where failure had geopolitical consequences. I understood electricity not just as a utility, but as a force, a language. And I understood the precise, often unforgiving vocabulary of the law when it came to property, liability, and willful negligence. The confrontation at my door had been the tipping point. It wasn't just the theft of power anymore. It was the galling, smug assumption that I would simply yield, that my boundaries were mere suggestions. It was the deployment of those two oafs, Dale and Reedy, as instruments of intimidation, a clear escalation. They crossed a line, a fundamental one. The one that separates petty annoyance from a direct challenge to one's sovereignty within their own defined space. My apartment, my parking stall, the utilities I paid for, these were extensions of my home, the sanctuary I'd built for Eleanor and myself. Bartlett's actions, amplified by the HOA's complicity, were a deliberate violation of that sanctuary. The moral calculus was stark. They had initiated aggression, repeatedly. They had ignored polite requests. They had escalated to intimidation. My response, therefore, would not be to plead or complain further up a chain of command that was clearly compromised. My response would be tactical, definitive, and designed to terminate the threat with prejudice. This wasn't about anger anymore. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. This was about a cold, clear imperative, a restoration of order, my order, within my domain. They don't know who I am, I thought, not with arrogance, but with a grim sense of irony. They saw a quiet man, perhaps a bit of a pushover. They didn't see the mind that could dismantle complex systems, or the resolve that had been tempered in crucibles far hotter than a condominium dispute. The dormant authority within me, the part that understood strategy and precise application of force, began to stir, not with relish, but with a somber sense of necessity. There would be no more notes, no more futile discussions. The time for communication in their language of bluster and entitlement was over. It was time for communication in a language they would understand viscerally, a language of undeniable consequence. My family, Eleanor's quiet reliance on the stability of our home, her untroubled sleep punctuated by the rhythm of her CPAP, these were the emotional anchors. The silent justification for the steps I was about to take. An attack on my resources was an indirect attack on her well-being, and that, above all else, was intolerable. The plan began to form, not as a rash impulse, but as a schematic, logical, and precise. It would be an elegant solution, in its own way. One that utilized my specific skill set. One that would be entirely legal if unorthodox, and one that Karen Bartlett would initiate herself, entirely of her own volition. The beauty of it, the surgical precision, was that her own greed, her own unwavering belief in her entitlement, would be the instrument of her reckoning. She would, quite literally, plug herself into her own downfall. The coming days would require patience, meticulous preparation, and an unwavering focus. The warrior archetype wasn't about seeking conflict, but about meeting it with overwhelming and intelligent force when it became unavoidable. Karen Bartlett had made it unavoidable. The planning phase was a meticulous immersion in technical specifications and legal nuances, a familiar terrain from my previous career. This wasn't an act of passion. It was the deliberate design of a consequence. My primary target: the external electrical outlet in my parking stall. My objective: to render it unsuitable for Bartlett's electric chariot in a way that was both technically sound for a different, specific purpose and legally defensible. First, reconnaissance. I observed Bartlett's routine. She usually plugged in her oversized EV monstrosity late in the evening, after most residents had retired, and unplugged it before the early morning rush. Arrogant, yet with a sliver of cunning to avoid direct confrontation during peak hours, she was consistent, predictable, a creature of habit. This predictability would be her undoing. Next, the technical specifications of her vehicle. A quick online search for the make and model revealed its onboard charger specifications. Like most EVs, it was designed to handle standard residential voltages, 120 volts level 1 charging, or 240 volts level 2. It would have protective circuitry, of course, designed to safeguard against minor fluctuations, surges, or incorrect phasing. But a sustained, significantly higher voltage, one far outside its operational parameters, that would likely overwhelm those safeguards, catastrophically. The key was significantly higher. The user's prompt mentioned 300V, a peculiar number, not standard for U.S. residential. But 300V DC is common in solar power systems, inverters, and certain specialized industrial equipment. If I were, hypothetically, experimenting with a custom high-power battery charging system for, say, a large uninterruptible power supply, UPS, or a very specific type of advanced power tool array I was developing, an outlet providing a non-standard voltage might be justifiable. The legal angle was paramount. I couldn't create a death trap. I couldn't booby-trap the outlet in a way that was indiscriminately dangerous. The modification had to be specific, and arguably for a legitimate, if niche, purpose of my own. And, crucially, there needed to be a warning. A clear, unambiguous warning. I consulted an old colleague, an expert in electrical codes and liability, phrasing my questions hypothetically, of course. If one were to modify a privately owned outlet on one's own property for a specialized piece of equipment requiring, say, 300 volts AC and clearly label it as such, what would be the liability if someone, trespassing, plugged in an incompatible device? The answer, carefully worded, was that liability generally hinged on foreseeability and duty of care. If the outlet was on private property, clearly marked for a specific, non-standard voltage, and the unauthorized user was trespassing and misusing the connection, the onus would largely shift to the trespasser. The trespassing part was key. Bartlett was already a proven trespasser. My old garage outlet, the one Bartlett coveted, was a NEMA 515R, standard 120V. I would replace it with something less common, perhaps a NEMA 630R, usually for 240V, but I would wire it differently. Internally, within the junction box and my own breaker panel, I would reconfigure the circuit. This wasn't about just stepping up the voltage with a simple transformer. That would be too crude, too obvious. It would involve isolating the circuit, ensuring it was robust enough to handle the modified current, and making sure it couldn't backfeed or affect any other part of the building's electrical system or my apartment. My previous profession had involved designing far more complex and dangerous systems under much greater scrutiny. This was, by comparison, child's play, but requiring the same meticulous attention to detail. I sourced the necessary components, a new industrial-grade receptacle designed for higher amperages, though I wouldn't be drawing high amps, high-quality, appropriately gauged wiring, a small custom-wound toroidal transformer I could build myself, capable of stepping up 120 VAC to a clean 300 VAC, not DC. as that would be more definitively destructive to AC design chargers, and a new dedicated circuit breaker, and, most importantly, a custom engraved metal warning placard. Warning: 300 volts AC. Specialized equipment only. Unauthorized use prohibited. Risk of severe equipment damage. The wording was crucial. Risk of severe equipment damage. Not personal injury, as the primary failure mode for the car would be fried electronics, not electrocution of the user if the car's grounding was intact. The plan was a tactical operation, silent, precise, and leaving minimal trace until the desired outcome. The target was identified, the ordnance selected, the legal parameters established. The moral justification was already embedded deep in my resolve. This was not merely about a car. It was about reclaiming stolen peace, punishing brazen entitlement, and delivering a lesson in consequences so profound it would never be forgotten. The anticipation was not of gleeful destruction, but of a deeply satisfying restoration of balance. The execution phase began under the cloak of a moonless Tuesday night. Well after 2 a.m., when the condominium complex was sunk in its deepest slumber. I wore dark, unassuming clothing, carrying a discreet toolkit. My movements were economical, honed by years of working in secure, often sensitive environments where drawing attention was a critical failure. The garage was cold, the air thick with the metallic tang of old oil and the faint, cloying sweetness of Bartlett's air freshener still clinging to the space around her oversized EV. Her car was there, plugged into her designated outlet for a change, a small, almost amusing irony. Perhaps my previous unplugging had momentarily shamed her into using her own resources, or perhaps she was simply biding her time, confident in her eventual triumph. It mattered little. The trap was being set for future transgressions. First, I killed the breaker to my external garage outlet from the panel inside my apartment. Safety first, always. Even in an act of calculated retribution, professionalism was paramount. I then proceeded to my parking stall. The existing outlet box was standard, easily accessible. Working by the dim, focused beam of a headlamp, I unscrewed the faceplate. The wiring within was straightforward. I disconnected the old NEMA 515R receptacle. It felt almost symbolic, removing the original point of contention. Next, the installation of the new, heavier-duty NEMA 630R receptacle. It was physically different, requiring a specific plug type, which Bartlett's standard EV cord wouldn't have. This was part of the subtlety. She couldn't accidentally plug into it. If she chose to use it, she would have to acquire an adapter, a conscious, deliberate act of bypassing a clear physical and visual deterrent. Inside the junction box, I made the necessary wiring changes, not to deliver 240 V, as the L630R would normally imply, but preparing it for the custom voltage feed. The delicate part was back in my apartment's utility closet, where the circuit originated. I installed the small, custom-built toroidal transformer I had assembled, designed to take the standard 120-volt AC and output a clean, stable 300-volt AC. It was a neat piece of engineering, compact and efficient. I integrated it into the isolated circuit, along with a new, appropriately rated breaker. Every connection was double-checked, every screw torqued to specification. This wasn't just about delivering a shock, it was about doing so reliably and safely, at least from my end of the circuit. The final, crucial step was affixing the warning label. I had two, one directly on the new faceplate of the outlet itself, and a larger, more prominent one on the concrete pillar directly above it, at eye level. The brushed aluminum placard was secured with industrial adhesive and two small, tamper-resistant screws. Warning: 300 volts AC, specialized equipment only, unauthorized use prohibited, risk of severe equipment damage. The red lettering on the metallic background was stark, unambiguous even in the dim garage light. No one could claim they hadn't seen it. No one could claim they weren't warned. I stood back, examining my work. The new outlet looked robust, professional. The warning label was prominent, severe. It was perfect. A silent, patient sentinel, waiting. I re-energized the circuit from my apartment panel. A quick check with a multimeter at the garage outlet confirmed the output, a steady 300.5 volts AC, precisely as planned. The entire operation had taken less than 90 minutes. Clean, efficient, untraceable to the casual observer. I packed my tools, leaving no sign of my nocturnal activity. As I walked back to my apartment, a profound sense of calm settled over me. Not triumph. Not yet. But the quiet satisfaction of a complex task executed flawlessly. The bait was laid, the trap was set. The next move belonged to Karen Bartlett. Her arrogance, her entitlement, her unwavering belief that she could take what she wanted without consequence. These were the forces that would now draw her inexorably towards the reckoning I had so carefully prepared. The silence of the sleeping building felt different now, charged with a potent, invisible current. It was the silence of inevitability. The days that followed the modification were a study in controlled patience, a state of cold-blooded calm beneath which thrummed an almost imperceptible current of anticipation. Outwardly, I maintained my routine. Polite nods to neighbors, the mundane rhythm of condominium life. Internally, however, I was an observer, a strategist watching the board, waiting for the opponent's inevitable self-destructive move. I noted Karen Bartlett's movements with a detached precision. For 2 days, she continued to use her own outlet, or perhaps she charged elsewhere. A flicker of doubt? Unlikely. More probable was that she was lulling herself, and perhaps me, into a false sense of resolution. Or maybe the HOA cops had advised a temporary cooling-off period. It didn't matter. Her pattern was established. Her arrogance was a constant. The orange serpent of her extension cord remained coiled in the trunk of her eco-behemoth, waiting. My wife, Eleanor, noticed a subtle shift in me, a quiet intensity. "Everything all right, love?" she asked one evening, her gaze perceptive. "Just a few lingering issues with the HOA," I replied, my voice even. "Nothing to worry about. I'm handling it." She trusted me, accepted my reassurance, though her eyes held a knowing softness. She knew the steel beneath my quiet demeanor, the part of me that didn't bend when pushed too far. On the third evening, as I was reviewing some old schematics, a habit from my past life that I found strangely soothing, my internal surveillance system, honed by years of anticipating threats, registered a subtle shift in the ambient sounds from the garage below. It was late, close to 11, prime time for Bartlett's furtive power appropriations. I didn't move, didn't react visibly. Instead, I focused, listening. There was the familiar hum of the garage ventilation, the distant rumble of traffic, and then a faint, distinct series of clicks and scrapes. The sound of a trunk opening, the rustle of a heavy cable being uncoiled. My heart rate remained steady, a testament to the cold discipline I'd cultivated. There was no elation, no nervousness, only a profound sense of inevitability. She was taking the bait. I pictured her in the dim garage light, her expression likely a mixture of defiance and smug self-assurance, believing she was once again outsmarting the quiet man in 3B. Perhaps she'd even acquired an adapter for the new NEMA L630R outlet, or perhaps she'd forced her standard plug into it, a testament to her brute force entitlement. The warning labels, stark and clear, would have been right in her line of sight. She would have seen them, and she would have dismissed them. Specialized equipment. She'd scoff. "He's just trying to scare me." Her narcissism wouldn't allow her to believe the warning was real, or that the quiet Mr. Henderson was capable of such a definitive countermeasure. There was a pause, then the distinct, soft thud of a charging port door being closed, a final, metallic click as the plug seated. Contact. The circuit was complete. I closed my eyes for a moment, not in prayer, but in focus. Step 1. Unauthorized connection. Step 2. Deliberate disregard of explicit warnings. Step 3. Activation of a system designed for a specific, albeit non-standard, purpose. Her actions, all hers. The waiting was the hardest part of any operation. But this wait was different. It was imbued with a certainty. The laws of physics are immutable. The principles of electrical engineering, unforgiving. 300 volts AC into a system designed for 120, 240 was not a suggestion. It was a command for catastrophic failure. I listened. For a moment, only the low hum from below. Then, a faint, almost inaudible pop, followed by another, slightly louder. A strange, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the vicinity of her parking stall, a sound that cut through the usual garage ambiance like a surgeon's scalpel. The game was afoot, and Karen Bartlett had just made her final move. The high-pitched whine from the garage intensified, quickly joined by a series of sharp, cracking sounds, like dry kindling snapping in a fire, but with a distinctly electrical, acrid undertone. My calm was absolute, a still point in the unfolding chaos I had meticulously engineered. I didn't need to see it. I could visualize the scene with chilling clarity. The onboard charger of Bartlett's expensive electric SUV, force-fed 300 volts of alternating current it was never designed to ingest, was engaged in a terminal argument with the laws of physics. Fuses would have blown instantly, but the sustained overvoltage would bypass those initial safeguards, seeking out weaker points in the circuitry. Capacitors would rupture, integrated circuits would melt. Wiring insulation would begin to smolder. Then came the smell. Faint at first, then rapidly strengthening, the unmistakable, stomach-churning aroma of burning plastic, superheated electronics, and scorched metal. It seeped under the door, a toxic perfume announcing the success of my carefully laid plan. This was no longer a subtle electrical malfunction. This was becoming a thermal event. I rose slowly from my chair, moving with deliberate calm, not towards the window, but towards my phone. The time for passive observation was over. The public reckoning was about to begin. A new sound joined the cacophony from below, a sudden guttural whoomph, followed by the unmistakable crackle of open flame. The whine died abruptly, replaced by a more primal, angrier roar. Her car was burning, not just smoking, but actively, vigorously burning. From my fourth-floor window, which overlooked the parking structure at an angle, I could now see an angry, flickering orange glow emanating from the garage entrance, painting the sterile, concrete walls with dancing, demonic light. It was a dramatic, almost cinematic spectacle of destruction. The first shouts echoed from outside, distant at first, then closer. "Fire! Car fire in the garage!" The building's central alarm system, likely triggered by smoke detectors in the garage, suddenly blared to life. A series of ear-splitting whoops and a stentorian, recorded voice instructing residents to evacuate. Doors slammed open in the hallway. Footsteps pounded. I remained in my apartment, a silent observer of the unfolding drama. My role in the active phase was complete. Now it was about managing the aftermath, about letting the events play out according to their own inexorable logic. I could hear Karen Bartlett's voice now, a high-pitched shriek of disbelief and fury, cutting through the alarm and the general commotion. My car! My car! Someone call 911! It's going to explode." Her panic was an almost satisfying counterpoint to my own icy composure. Fire sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder. The response would be swift. Our building was in a densely populated area. I watched as emergency vehicle lights began to flash against nearby buildings, painting streaks of red and blue across my living room wall. The visual metaphor was not lost on me. The red of destruction, the blue of the authorities who would, I was confident, find no fault with my actions. The smell of smoke was now thick even within my apartment, despite the closed windows. Eleanor emerged from the bedroom, her face etched with alarm, the CPAP mask in her hand. "What on earth is happening?" "Fire in the garage, it seems," I said, my voice a mask of detached concern. "Ms. Bartlett's car, I believe. We should probably head downstairs, just to be safe, though the fire appears contained to the parking structure." I offered her my arm. No sign of agitation, no hint of the profound, almost visceral satisfaction that was slowly beginning to uncoil within me. It wasn't the destructive act itself that gratified me, but the perfect, undeniable justice of it. She had sown the wind. She was now reaping the whirlwind. As we joined the stream of residents evacuating, the full scene came into view. Firefighters were already on site, hoses snaking across the driveway. Bartlett's EV was fully engulfed, a raging pyre of expensive plastics and rapidly depleting lithium-ion batteries, sending plumes of acrid black smoke into the night sky. It was a monument to her arrogance, immolated by her own hand. And my meticulously prepared outlet, the source of its destruction, was just a few feet away, pristine and untouched, its warning label gleaming faintly in the emergency lights. Karen Bartlett was a spectacle of unrestrained hysteria. Her carefully constructed facade of HOA fueled authority had crumbled, revealing the raw, shrieking entitlement beneath. "It was him!" she screamed, pointing a trembling, soot-stained finger towards me as Eleanor and I stood calmly with a group of other evacuated residents a safe distance away. "Henderson! He did this! He sabotaged my car!" Her face was contorted, streaked with tears and grime, her expensive athleisure wear singed in places where she'd presumably gotten too close to her automotive inferno. Several firefighters and a police officer, who had just arrived, turned their attention towards her, then towards me. I met their gazes with an expression of mild, bewildered concern, perhaps a touch of pity for the distraught woman. "Ma'am, please calm down," one of the firefighters said, his voice firm but professional. "We need to understand what happened." "He threatened me," Bartlett shrieked, her voice cracking. "He kept unplugging my charger. He rigged that outlet. I know he did. He's some kind of electrical terrorist." The term electrical terrorist almost made me smile, a fleeting internal amusement. The hyperbole was exquisite. The police officer, a Sergeant Miller according to his name tag, approached me. He was calm, observant, his eyes assessing. "Sir, do you know this woman?" "Miss Bartlett is a neighbor," I replied, my tone even and respectful. "There has been some disagreement about her use of my designated parking stall's electrical outlet to charge her vehicle. She's been stealing my power," I clarified, keeping my voice measured. "I've asked her to stop. I even left notes. Yesterday, she sent 2 men from the HOA to my door to try and intimidate me into letting her continue." Officer Miller's gaze sharpened slightly. "Intimidate you?" "They strongly recommended I allow her to use my outlet, implying repercussions if I didn't," I stated flatly. I declined. Bartlett, meanwhile, was still raving. "He changed the outlet. It looked different. There was a warning, but I thought it was just him being difficult." Her admission, blurted out in her panic, was pure gold. She admitted seeing the warning. She admitted choosing to ignore it. She admitted using an outlet that visibly appeared different and was clearly labeled. Officer Miller turned back to me. "Sir, is it your outlet she was plugged into tonight?" "I believe so, officer," I said, "though I can't be certain from this distance. However, the outlet in my stall, Unit 3B, was indeed recently upgraded by me, for my own specialized equipment." This was the critical juncture. My legal shield. "Specialized equipment?" Miller asked, his pen poised over a small notebook. "Yes, I'm a retired electrical engineer. I do some hobbyist work with high-voltage power systems. I reconfigured that specific outlet to provide 300 volts AC for a custom piece of test bench equipment I'm developing. The outlet was changed to a type that wouldn't accept a standard plug without an adapter, and it's very clearly labeled with multiple warnings regarding the specific voltage and prohibiting unauthorized use." I paused, then added, "The warnings explicitly state risk of severe equipment damage. I installed them precisely to prevent any accidental misuse." Miller's eyes flickered towards the still smoldering hulk of the EV, then back to me. A flicker of something? Understanding? Professional respect for a clear explanation? Crossed his face. "And Ms. Bartlett would have needed an adapter to use that outlet with her vehicle's standard charging cord? Or she would have had to deliberately force the plug or use some other non-standard means of connection," I replied. "Either way, it would have been a conscious act to bypass the physical incompatibility and the explicit warnings." Bartlett, overhearing this, let out another wail. "He set a trap. It's a booby trap." "Ma'am," Officer Miller said, his patience clearly wearing thin, Modifying one's own property for a specific use, and clearly labeling it as such, is generally not illegal. Using someone else's clearly marked specialized electrical outlet without permission, especially if it results in damage to your own equipment due to incompatibility, well, that's a different matter. He looked back at me. Do you have any documentation for this specialized equipment, or the outlet modification? I have receipts for the new receptacle and components, and I can show you the designs for the equipment it's intended for if necessary, I said calmly. The warning labels are, of course, still in place. Or should be. The fire chief, having conferred with his team, approached Officer Miller. Looks like the primary ignition was an electrical fault, originating from the vehicle's charging system, Sergeant. Massive overload. Whatever it plugged into fed it way too much juice. He glanced at Bartlett's car, then at the pillar where my outlet was located. That outlet over there, he gestured with his chin, seems to be the one the cord was running to. We'll need to check it, but from the looks of that placard, it's not your standard 120. Officer Miller nodded. The owner states it's a 300-volt outlet, clearly marked. The fire chief whistled softly. Yeah, that'd do it to an EV charger, all right. Fry it like an egg. Karen Bartlett stared, dumbfounded, as the pieces clicked into place, not for her vindication, but for her complete and utter self-inflicted defeat. Her accusations were turning to ash, just like her car. The investigation, as I had anticipated, was remarkably straightforward once the initial hysteria subsided. Officer Miller and a fire inspector meticulously examined my parking stall. The custom-engraved metal warning placards were, of course, pristine, their red lettering stark against the brushed aluminum, clearly visible even in the dim emergency lighting. The NEMA 630R receptacle was undamaged, a silent testament to its robust construction and the fact that the failure had occurred within Bartlett's vehicle, not at the supply point. I calmly explained the nature of my entirely plausible, if conveniently timed, hobbyist project involving high-voltage test bench equipment. I even offered to show them the preliminary schematics I'd sketched out, conveniently vague enough to be unchallengeable, yet specific enough to sound legitimate to a layperson or even a mildly curious official. They weren't deeply interested in my fictional project. They were interested in liability and negligence. So, just to be clear, Mr. Henderson, Officer Miller summarized his pen-making notes. You modified an outlet on your property for your own specific use with a non-standard voltage. You installed a physically different type of receptacle. You placed clear, prominent warning labels indicating the voltage and prohibiting unauthorized use, stating a risk of equipment damage, correct? That is entirely correct, officer. I affirmed, my voice a model of cooperative calm. Ms. Bartlett. He turned to where she sat slumped on a curb, attended by a paramedic checking her for smoke inhalation. She was, predictably, fine, aside from her shattered ego. Did you see these warning labels before plugging in your vehicle? Karen mumbled something, her earlier fury deflated into a sullen resentment. I saw something. I thought he was just trying to be difficult. To stop me from charging. So you acknowledge seeing a warning, and you chose to plug in anyway, possibly using an adapter or forcing the connection? Miller pressed. Her silence was damning. The fire inspector chimed in. The damage to the vehicle is consistent with a massive overvoltage to the charging system. If that outlet is outputting 300 volts AC, and the car was expecting 120 or 240, this is the predictable outcome. The vehicle's internal safeguards would be overwhelmed. He shrugged. User error, essentially. Or perhaps unauthorized use of an incompatible power source despite clear warnings. Officer Miller closed his notebook. Well, Ms. Bartlett, he said, his tone devoid of sympathy, it appears the damage to your vehicle was a direct result of it being connected to a power source it was not designed for. A source that was clearly marked as non-standard, and for specialized use only on private property. Mr. Henderson seems to have taken reasonable steps to label his modified outlet. There's no indication of criminal intent or negligence on his part. This appears to be a civil matter, or more accurately, a very unfortunate consequence of your own actions. Karen stared at him, aghast. Civil matter? My car is destroyed. He has to pay. On what grounds, ma'am? Miller asked, his patience now visibly frayed. He warned you. You ignored the warning. You trespassed on his electricity after being told not to. Frankly, any legal action you attempted would likely be unrewarding. The deadpan sarcasm was subtle but clear. The couldn't take legal action on me, part of my internal plan, had just been validated by uniformed authority. My meticulous preparation, the carefully worded warnings, the specific choice of receptacle, it had all formed an unbreachable legal shield. The law, when understood and utilized with precision, could be a powerful ally. Dale and Reedy, the HOA cops, had arrived at some point during the commotion, looking bewildered and impotent. They hovered at the edge of the scene, their earlier bluster entirely absent. When Bartlett tried to appeal to them, Dale just shook his head, avoiding eye contact. Even they could see the tide had turned irrevocably. The supporting legal ally, in this case, wasn't a person I brought, but the very structure of property law and negligence doctrine articulated by Officer Miller. He was the reluctant authority figure who, by simply applying the facts to the law, legitimized my retaliation. As the fire crew finished dampening down the molten remains of the EV and the initial crowd of residents began to disperse, a sense of profound, quiet satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't the destructive spectacle that pleased me. It was the elegant, undeniable justice. The system, both electrical and legal, had performed exactly as predicted. The aftermath was a quiet victory, a restoration of order so complete it was almost anticlimactic. Karen Bartlett's charred automotive carcass was eventually towed away, leaving a blackened stain on the concrete of her parking stall, a permanent, ugly reminder of her hubris. She made no further attempts to engage with me, directly or indirectly. The HOA, suddenly bereft of its chief instigator's aggressive certainty, lapsed into a stunned silence regarding power outlet allocations. Dale and Reedy seemed to shrink whenever they saw me, their faux authority deflated like a punctured tire. The other neighbors, the silent majority who had undoubtedly witnessed Bartlett's reign of petty tyranny and my subsequent decisive countermeasure, regarded me with a newfound, almost fearful respect. There were no congratulatory handshakes, no overt acknowledgments, just subtle shifts in demeanor, quicker nods in the hallway, a wider berth given in the elevator, a general sense of a boundary having been firmly and somewhat terrifyingly re-established. They didn't know the specifics of what I'd done, only that the problem of Karen Bartlett's encroaching entitlement had been spectacularly and permanently solved. My specialized 300-volt AC outlet remained, its warning placard a silent sentinel. I even, for a time, considered actually building the fictitious high-voltage test bench equipment just to complete the narrative, but it seemed unnecessary. The deterrent effect was absolute. The porch light, so to speak, or in this case the garage outlet, was back under my control. The psychological closure was profound. The constant, low-level irritation of Bartlett's presence and her petty aggressions had vanished, replaced by a calm that permeated our small corner of the building. Eleanor, though never privy to the precise mechanics of my solution, sensed the shift. "Things seem quieter?" she observed one evening a week later. "The ambient stress levels in the building appear to have significantly decreased," I replied, allowing myself a small, dry smile. She smiled back, a knowing, trusting smile. She didn't need the details. She just needed the peace, and I had secured it. The tactical operation had been a success. The symbolic revenge, tied not to family legacy but to the simple, fierce protection of my family's present peace, was complete. There was a moral cost, perhaps, in the cold-blooded calculation of it all, a step taken into a realm of retaliation that most people only fantasize about. The blood, in this case, was the scorched metal and melted plastic of her car, the public embarrassment, the stripping away of her delusional authority. But it was a cost I had weighed and willingly paid to end her campaign of harassment. My local corruption ties, in this case, were not connections I exploited, but the HOA's own internal rot and Bartlett's misuse of its structure, which I exposed through the simple act of refusing to yield and then applying a precise, technically sound counter. The climactic confrontation had been her public meltdown, her accusations turning to ash in the face of cold logic and undeniable fact. One afternoon, a neighbor from down the hall, a quiet older gentleman named Mr. Abernathy, who had always seemed particularly oppressed by Bartlett's HOA pronouncements, caught my eye as I was getting my mail. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That, electric car situation? Quite the display." I met his gaze, my expression neutral. "Indeed, Mr. Abernathy. A powerful reminder about respecting boundaries and reading warning labels." He blinked, then a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Quite so." He nodded again and continued on his way. That was all. But it was enough. The message had been received, not just by Bartlett but by the wider community. The locked gate of my resolve had held. My little patch of suburban territory was secure. The war, such as it was, had been won not through shouting or escalation of petty grievances, but through superior planning, technical acumen, and an unflinching commitment to a just and final resolution. And sometimes, that's the only language understood. The quiet hum of our apartment, the steady rhythm of Eleanor's CPAP machine in the night, these were the sounds of victory. A victory bought with surgical precision and a cold, hard, and ultimately very effective form of justice.